Hello everyone, this is your host Professor Reha here with the part 2 of the Ritualist deep examination series. Now, I feel like I rushed a little bit through the 3 builds that I covered in the part 1, so I will be doing a quick recap of those 3. So we're going to be starting with Uroboruk's Guise. This is the Necromancer exclusive set. It increases Drain Essence, obviously. We have some mild preference for Aether damage, again, quite obviously. Now, the interesting thing and the most useful thing about this set, in my opinion, is the Bone Barrier. The fact that you can just activate this for the absorption is fantastic. This actually can really save your life, since pretty much everything does physical. This is one of the more useful barriers that you can have in the game in terms of barriers produced by equipment, simply because it does cover that barrier and for up to 12,000 damage. Yes, there are going to be enemies that are primarily going to be doing some kind of ranged attack that isn't necessarily going to be damage. I'm sorry, not necessarily going to be physical damage, but physical damage is the most common variety of damage. Anything that hits you directly in your face is going to most likely be doing physical damage, with a couple of exceptions, but that's a general rule for the most part. The actual set itself, I'm really only primarily going to be talking about the most interesting points here. The fact that the Drain Essence drains even more health, which is very important, considering that the skill has some issues by itself of actually healing you to where you want to be. I find that this is quite useful. Uroboruk's Will, being just randomly activating, can actually sometimes save your life in particularly ugly circumstances, such as you're getting swarmed, maybe you're in the Crucible, or you've just activated a totem, and you're getting, a little swamped. This will blast out and terrify some of the enemies, give you some breathing room. This is actually kind of a bad thing in the Shattered Realm, where you're trying to kill enemies as quickly as possible within that time limit. So if you're looking to play the Ritualist in the Shattered Realm, maybe this isn't such a good idea, because then you have to actually potentially chase them down, which could be a little bit of a problem. It really depends. Often in the Shattered Realm, it's not a huge problem because Terrify doesn't last very long, but say this activates at the very end of a fight and a more durable enemy runs away, and now because you've just cleared out everyone else, or most everyone else, they're the last one left, so you actually have to chase them down. So there is a rare situation in which this is a negative in the Shattered Realm, but that's about the only thing I would have to say probably wouldn't be great overall. The only real downside to Terrify, but the rest, in pretty much every other context, it's great. There's very interestingly a increase in maximum poison, acid, and aether resistance here. Now, the aether resistance is definitely the more useful of these two. Poison and acid isn't exactly quite as common. It's very useful against the Slith, who primarily do poison acid damage, so there is that benefit there. Random beasts, there are the occasional ethereal that does poison acid damage. Heroes, of course, that do that. There's actually a small number of ethereal enemies that do poison acid damage, but overall, it's quite useful. What's also incredibly useful is adding an extra second to the duration of Siphon Souls. If you're not sure of how this works, when you use Siphon Souls, you are actually draining all enemies around you for normally 3 seconds or so. But this making it to 4 seconds means you heal a little bit more health and you deal a little bit more damage, so that is really nice. Excellent thing to see there. The extra Aether damage on Siphon Souls is not a huge deal, it's just a nice to have. I feel like no, okay. The Mantle is pretty standard. You got some increases, you've got some increases to your skills, pretty standard. Same thing with the chest piece. Examining the actual skills here, obviously nothing in the Shaman. Here are the skills the set actually increases. Obviously, you've got Harbinger of Souls here, for the increased everything. And you've got Mark of Torment. Now, Mark of Torment is an interesting skill. It's not something that a lot of people necessarily immediately see a use for. But let me tell you that in the Shattered Realm and in the Crucible, you see an enemy winding up for a major attack, or even some of the bosses at the ends of the campaigns, such as, what's his name, the Shaper of Flesh, or whatever his name is, Korvac. There's also the Ligorian, or whatever, however you pronounce that, at the end of the main campaign. Well, the Ligorian doesn't really have a huge attack, but the other two do have a big attack with huge wind-ups. For example, the Master of Flesh has that dive that leaves the aether damage kind of floating around. So there is that as an example. But if you see that wind-up happening, you can blast out a Mark of Torment really quick and take half that damage, but reflect triple the half damage that you just took back to them. So it can be very useful in those contexts. I find this particular skill highly useful in the Shattered Realm facing off against Shattered Guardians. Not all of the Shattered Guardians are going to have a really obvious wind-up attack. I find, for example, the Troll bosses do. They very frequently have a excellent wind-up, a very obvious wind-up where they lift the club over their head. Very obvious example there, but things of that nature. So this is very useful in the main campaign, in the Shattered Realm, in the Crucible for these reasons, but against bog-standard enemies, you're really not going to be using this much, unless, of course, again, you're in the Crucible or the Shattered Realm, and a hero waltzes up to you and is clearly going to be pulling off some kind of big stunt. So let's talk about the devotion points here for this. Now, obviously, you're going to be leaning towards Ratosh the Veil Warden. This gives you increases in Aether damage and Vitality damage, and there is a mild preference for Vitality damage, which, of course, is fairly obvious from both the Harbinger of Souls. You can see where it's doing extra bonus damage and bonus Vitality and bonus Vitality decay over time. It's converting the physical damage to Vitality damage specifically, so there is a mild preference for Vitality damage. Also, the set itself just overall has a Vitality. It's about even across the board, but do keep in mind, interestingly enough, that the Vitality damage is converted to Aether damage, which means, technically speaking, your Drain Essence will be doing... it'll be doing the same amount just in Aether damage, but what this really means... The real problem with that, for me, is the fact that the Will of Ratosh decreases Vitality resistance, so you actually have to go elsewhere for your Aether resistance, which you go into Arcane Bomb here. Now, there is the benefit here that the Arcane Bomb reduces Aether resistance more than the Will of Ratosh decreases Vitality resistance, which is nice and all. So, in the long run, yes, but you do actually have to go a little bit out of your way. You will actually see the Widow a lot in the Ritualist, because throughout these sets that I'm going to be talking about throughout this video, you're going to see the Widow presented to you very frequently, simply because for the Ritualist, no matter what build you run, the Widow is probably going to give you some kind of advantage. The only exception to this is if you're running a pure pet build. That's the only time I would say maybe the Widow isn't that useful, and you could probably skip the Widow. But for anything, even with the Primal Bond hybrid build, the Widow is going to present you with some use, because the Shaman has the lightning damage, and the Necromancer obviously has the Aether damage, right? So with this particular setup here, you're going to see variations of this pretty commonly for any kind of purely non-pet build. But you're going to see, obviously, the Bat, which, you know, if you're going to splash in the, if you're going to splash in Shaman skills, you're going to see that bleeding damage be even more useful. But you've also got Siphon Souls with Blood Boil, which does bleeding damage, so you can just heal a little bit more with that through the Bat there. Of course, the Wendigo, which increases your Vitality damage, gives you some physical resistance, which is very nice. Vitality damage here, there's Spirit here, Health here, Vitality damage, and at the end you have the Wendigo's Mark, which just gives you a decent amount of conversion from this Vitality damage. It's not a lot of Vitality damage, admittedly, but the fact that it can happen for whatever amount of time, it happens for 10 seconds, and how often this actually triggers depends on the individual ability. The 15% chance on attack is kind of a rough estimate, but the actual percentage will change based on what ability you have it on. So the fact that this will just randomly be triggering on enemies around you is very useful, especially since it doesn't actually have a refresh, so you can actually theoretically hit multiple enemies with this, which is really nice to see. If I'm understanding that correctly, which I believe I am. Beyond that, I put the points here in the Fox just for the bleeding and the stats. You don't necessarily have to. This video isn't necessarily... I want to make this very clear. I'm not trying to say you absolutely must build this way. These are suggestions based on my experiences with the build and with the classes individually and together. So just take these as rough suggestions. But I do usually go into the Fox here for the extra bleeding damage. You can see I haven't used all the points here. Put the 12 points wherever you feel most comfortable. If you splash in the Shaman, maybe going for the Assassin's Mark would be very helpful to increase that physical damage. Maybe you want to splash in a couple more points of blue. You could very easily put 3 points into the Lizard here, and then rush to the Hand of Ultos, get some nice lightning damage increases for the Shaman side of things if you really want to. That really all depends on what you want to do. I do typically splash in Dryad's Blessing because I just like the health restore. The armor boost is really nice, but most importantly, the reduction in bleeding and poison is really, really nice to have. And of course, you get healing increases from the Lotus here, which is really nice. With your Siphon Souls, this also is extremely nice. With your Drain Essence, the Lizard operates the same way. Healing effects increase by 6%, which is why I just mentioned the Lizard specifically. You could, of course, go into Tsunami if you wanted the cold and lightning damage out of that, or if you wanted just stats, you could go into the Sailor's Guide. You've got all kinds of options. I just really prefer the Lizard because it does increase your health effects. It does give you some excellent movement speed, which helps you just travel around a little bit faster. This is especially important in the Shattered Realm. Now that we've kind of got that groundwork down, let's recap very quickly some of the equipment available for this particular set that you may want to think about. Now, of course, we have the Flesh Eater leg wraps. Now, this is already going to be enhancing Hungering Reach, which we already know is attached to Drain Essence, which we're already increasing. This also provides you with Wendigo Totem, which does, of course, the vitality and bleeding damage. Wendigo Totem is something that I really often combine with the Necromancer, and the reason why, if you're wondering, because you're probably asking yourself, well, Professor, why would you recommend Wendigo Totem when we already have Siphon Souls and Drain Essence? This is an excellent question. Now, specifically, keep in mind that Drain Essence and Siphon Souls drain life, or they basically heal you, based on a percentage of the damage they're doing. This is fine. But there are going to be times where you either, in the case of Siphon Souls, you don't have enough enemies to consistently drain. Also in the case of Siphon Souls, you're surrounded by vitality-resistant enemies, which is a problem for Siphon Souls, because unlike Drain Essence, which does vitality and aether damage, so it doesn't much care, people who resist vitality damage don't usually resist aether damage that well, and vice versa. There are exceptions, but we'll get to that in a bit. But with Siphon Souls, it does vitality and bleeding damage, and although the bleeding damage will be getting through and healing you a decent bit percentage-wise, it's still not as high as the damage that it's going to be doing through vitality. So you come up against Chthonics, or even worse, the Cannibals and the Ugdenbug and the Gloomwald, who are pretty resistant to both vitality and bleeding, and you're going to have a very hard time draining them. And of course, with the Drain Essence, even though it does both Aether and Vitality damage, and can drain Ethereals and Chthonics equally as well, each one of those is resisting one of its 2 primary damage types, so you're only really going to be healing somewhere between half and 3/4 of your potential damage output, because they're going to be resisting one of your damage types, so it's going to be reduced by a decent bit, and it can be very difficult to drain even a single target if it's one of these 2, especially if it happens to be a Chthonic who is resistant to Aether damage. There are specific heroes that are. Or if you're facing off against an Ethereal resistant to Vitality, again, there are Ethereal heroes that specifically are. So it can be somewhat difficult for specific targets to drain off of them. So Wendigo Totem, which, by the way, does not care about what damage is doing. Mend Wounds is just healing you flat out. It does not even remotely care about what damage it's dealing. So Life Tap, even if Life Tap is doing absolutely diddly squat to the enemy, Mend Wounds will still keep you alive, and it's very useful for that reason. So just do keep that in mind, that there is an actual point to Wendigo Totem here. Furthermore, this does increase the amount of attack damage converted to health, which is always really nice, and increases that bleeding damage a little bit more, which helps both Wendigo Totem and Siphon Souls, obviously. So it's just something to really think about. The Deadwalker foot pads, very similar scenario as the previous one. This is specifically increasing vitality and aether damage and increases drain essence. Also reduces your stun duration, which is really nice, and it has the drain soul. Now in this particular context, this is a bit more useful than the pants, but since the set itself does not actually include pants, and of course there isn't really a whole lot of pants available that boost this, I'll be talking about I won't be covering every item available to you in this video, just the ones that I have found through personal experimentation work really well with the set, and this is the biggest pair of pants that I go to. This is actually usually my go-to, just because it does, like I said, increase Wendigo Totem, Hungering Reach. This combines really well with that, Drain Essence and Wendigo Totem. It's got some great resistance stats here. You've got some physical resistance, you've got some pierce resistance, which is of course very important because of the inability to enhance that through a consumable, and I believe there isn't really... Is there pierce resistance on any of these? I can't remember off the top of my head. There is some pierce resistance here, but otherwise, and there's some physical resistance here that I forgot to mention, but we have the, we have some great stats on this. Movement speed, again, great if you're in the Shattered Realm, and of course, just random drain souls whenever you get hit. It does have a skill recharge, but it's only 2 seconds, so it can still happen very frequently, and that's a decent amount of healing there. So I am really fond of the mythical Deadwalker foot pads. These are quite a good time. Now we're going to talk about weapons pretty extensively, and the Blood Render is one that I occasionally use here. Again, we're talking about vitality and bleeding increases. We're talking about a physical damage conversion, which you will remember that the Harbinger of Souls is also putting in a physical damage conversion, so this is actually doing quite a decent bit of vitality damage. We have some nice attack speed increases here. This specifically is increasing Blood Boil, which of course, is here, the Siphon Souls, and you will also notice that it has various increases to Siphon Souls besides. It makes Siphon Souls last even longer and do more bleeding damage, and actually increases the duration by a lot. Now, I could give you, I mean, just with this alone, you are looking at a, I think, like a, what is it, a 7.5 seconds, but if you combine that with the increase of the Siphon Souls from here, you're actually looking at a default of 6 seconds, so you're actually looking at a roughly 9-second Siphon Souls if I'm doing my math right. So this actually is, oh no, I'm sorry, this is the bleeding damage, pardon me. So the bleeding damage lasts longer, but Siphon Souls itself, with this combined with the Ouroboros set, is lasting a full 6 seconds. You're essentially doubling the length of time Siphon Souls is lasting, and you can splash in Savagery as well. Whether or not you want to go necessarily the full way with Savagery, I usually don't, because obviously this is increasing the physical damage, which you are converting, right? You are converting the lightning damage here, so you actually could very easily slap this in, but I usually only go up to Tenacity of the Boar if I go any further than that at all. Keep in mind you can pull the 10 points out of here very easily if you really want to go ballistic, but I will usually go up to maybe about this far, but I'm not usually going to go up the Storm Touched. If you really want to, you absolutely can. You can pull out a couple of points here. You could actually ignore Mark of Torment if you really don't like that. I know it's not for everyone. And just kind of go ballistic on Storm Touched here, and then max out Wendigo Totem, or you could just choose not to use Wendigo Totem at all. Totally up to you, but it does give you that very interesting, option of having Savagery available to you in a purely Vitality version, which is incredibly useful for the build. I'm spending a lot of time, by the way, on this first set because this is going to lay the groundwork for later sets that we're going to be talking about. Another option, though, is the Bone Scythe. Now, this offers you Bone Harvest. This isn't something I use very often with this set. I usually prefer Blood Render because it offers me a little bit more. Yes, it makes Wendigo Totem free and spammable, but beyond that, I don't usually use Bone Harvest with this set, personally speaking. It's just not something I often find myself using in this set, just because I would rather have Wendigo Totem, I'd rather have Savagery for some better individual target damage that I can combine with Drain Essence. It's totally up to you, though. Again, there are people who just want to spam and Drain Essence the whole time and don't care about the Savagery, and that's something I can totally respect. I'm personally a fan, but again, that's just me. But I don't usually use Bone Harvest here, because Bone Harvest is doing some damage types that you're really not going to be increasing. Piercing and Cold specifically, yes, there is Vitality, but you're already doing plenty of Vitality. You've already got Bleeding damage, you've got Aether damage. I normally am a big proponent of 1 major damage type and 2 subtypes. But with the Ritualist, you have tons of different damage types that you can very easily incorporate here. For Pete's sakes, the way we're running now, we have Aether and Vitality. Considering that very few enemies resist both very well, it's often not very necessary for the Ritualist to deviate out of these two, in my opinion. And furthermore, you've got Spectral Wrath on top of that. You've got the Will of Ratosh being very easy to get your hands on. You have the Arcane Bomb, very easy to get your hands on from the Widow. It's just not hugely necessary for the Ritualist, or pretty much anything Necromancer, to really have to divert their damage very extensively, so I often don't go into Bone Harvest, despite normally being a proponent of a bit more damage diversification here, just because in the context of the Necromancer it really isn't needed. Yes, it does convert Bone Harvest to Vitality damage, but at the same time, then you're talking about a skill here which is doing pure Vitality damage, which you are already doing with other things. I just don't find Bone Harvest to be too useful here, overall, in my personal opinion. Again, I still prefer Blood Render, because at the very least with Savagery, I keep going back to that, at the very least with Savagery, I can increase my offensive ability and my health regeneration through Tenacity de Boar, so I actually have some better effects with that. Bone Harvest, just not really a huge fan of. I just don't really like that. You can if you're a big fan of Bone Harvest and you want to go for this, absolutely do so. It's just not my personal preference. That's really all I would have to say about that. It is an excellent weapon for the Wendigo Totem boost, and if you are a big fan of Bone Harvest, this is absolutely stunning. But it's just really not for me. Then we have the Mythical Doomsaw of Gluttony. This is, again, not as good, in my opinion, compared to the Savagery, but there is a couple of interesting points here. Namely, with this, first off, you are converting physical damage to Vitality damage again. This does do physical damage. This has bonus Vitality damage. It's converting a certain amount of its attack damage to health, and it's increasing physical and internal trauma damage. So you could actually, if you were feeling really bold, still go Savagery with this, but leaving it Lightning, Bleeding, and physical damage, and just going all the way out here. Again, not really my favorite thing. The Lifestealer Nova is really nice, but then you're really just... you could just be increasing Siphon Souls more. Something neither of these two do. It just really depends on how big of a fan you are of Siphon Souls. Then we have the Mythical Ravager's Bite. Now, this one is fairly interesting, because the actual Ravager's Bite is very useful. It is reducing Vitality resistance, which is extremely useful. It is looking at Dread and Soul Harvest, which, by the way, specifically is these. All the way up to here. Here's Soul Harvest. It boosts your cold and Vitality damage. Now, you'll notice that with the Ravager's Bite, it isn't converting Bone Harvest or Soul... sorry, not Bone Harvest. It's not converting Bone... it is Bone Harvest. It's not converting any of this to Vitality like the Bone Scythe is, right? It's leaving it cold, it's leaving it piercing, it's leaving it Vitality. Okay. But in an odd twist, this is actually fine because Soul Harvest is boosting this. So again, if you're a big fan of Bone Harvest in this context, go for it. This isn't the context I use Bone Harvest with, personally. But again, you can absolutely go into that. But Ravager's Bite is incredibly useful for this setup, especially if you find yourself having some problems with the Vitality-resistant enemies. This can really pull you out of that very effectively. Then we have the Howl of the Wendigo, which, of course, we have Blood Pact increase for the Wendigo Totem. You've got increased bleeding damage, you've got vitality damage increases, you're converting that physical damage once again, you're getting bonus health, you're getting attack speed, but you're getting much more out of Siphon Souls, and this is one of my more favorite things to do. I really like Blood Render, but ultimately this is the piece of equipment that I think probably I go back to most consistently, for a couple of reasons. Whereas the Blood Render, yes, sometimes I like to have fun with savagery, you know, just get a vitality savagery out there, that's a lot of fun, but in terms of actual function here, the Howl of the Wendigo matches a lot of the equipment we've been talking about much more closely. It better matches the Flesh Eater leggings, because we already have an interest in increasing Wendigo Totem from this and from the Deadwalker foot pads. Here we go. So I keep clicking on that one. The Howl of the Wendigo increasing Blood Pact, which is the second form of the Wendigo Totem, is very useful already off the top, and then increasing the damage of Siphon Souls, giving Siphon Souls vitality and bleeding resistance reduction, and making it a faster recharge, is incredibly delightful. Alright, while we don't have the increased 2 seconds of duration to Siphon Souls, that is true, the Howl of the Wendigo instead makes that faster to recharge. Now, the baseline recharge rate of this is, I believe, 6. Yes, it is. So this brings it down to 5, and you've, of course, already got a 4-second duration from the Ouroboros set in the first place. So every 5 seconds, you can pull a 4-second Siphon Souls. And you can understand, really. I mean, the only real difference here is that with Blood Render, you can actually theoretically run constant Siphon Souls, because by the time it's done recharging, the duration is ended, so you can just refresh that every 6 seconds. Which is, you know, fairly nice and all, but for me, the Howl of the Wendigo, with the reduced vitality and bleeding resistance, with the increased Blood Pact, I just find this to be a much more effective option than anything else, because you'll notice this increases Bone Harvest, this increases Blood Pact and Spectral Wrath, Spectral Wrath, excuse me, which is really nice. Lifestealer Nova is really nice, but compared to the Howl of the Wendigo, with its specific vitality resistance decrease, with an ability you've already invested points into, very, very effective, especially since, as I pointed out, you can't necessarily max Savagery out or the Bone Harvest very effectively. Consider that you've only got 40 points left over if you decide to keep Mark of Torment or all these other skills that you're boosting. You can barely get Soul Harvest in, which is fine. That's perfectly fine, but you can't really cram in Wendigo Totem, and between the two of between Bone Harvest and Wendigo Totem, the healing from Wendigo Totem I value a little bit more. Just as a personal preference. So I do really enjoy the Howl of the Wendigo here. Again, this is down to my personal preference. But for similar reasons as the Blood Render, we're increasing Siphon Souls here. We can have... This is more of a fun thing, but I do really enjoy playing that. Bone Harvest is good. You can fit this in. It's just not my favorite thing to use in this context. Same thing for here with the Blood Pact and Spectral Wrath. This is very standard. Probably out of the ones here, likely the least effective, because this isn't doing necessarily anything for resistance. This isn't necessarily doing anything for, you know, adding in new abilities. This gives you a really good reason to use Bone Harvest here, and Wendigo Totem, which is up to you. This, of course, does both as well, but I think this just flows a little bit better, in my opinion. The Spirit Crusher is really for those who really want to double down on the Necromancer part. You only bust out the Wendigo Totem, you increase everything else you're doing here, and this is really effective as well. It does give you a mild decrease to vitality resistance when you trigger this, but which is, by the way, really nice. It also decreases enemy health regeneration and attack speed and casting speed. This is really lovely as well. This is also one that I really like. I still prefer Howl of the Wendigo because I do like the boosts to the Siphon Souls, but if you either don't have the Howl of the Wendigo, or you just want an overall boost to all of your Necromancer abilities, then the Mythical Spirit Crusher is going to be better off. I think if you were going to use the Mythical Spirit Crusher, this is the best set to use it with, in my opinion. But again, down to personal preference, Howl of the Wendigo. This is a fantastic choice, though. Extremely strong choice. It depends on how much you value these stat decreases compared to what the Howl of the Wendigo does with Siphon Souls. That's a personal preference there. The Soul Bearer, again, we have Wendigo Totem, we have Soul Harvest, We have Bone Harvest. We're doing Bone Harvest with Vitality damage. We're having longer lasting and more spammable Wendigo totems. It does Vitality damage. This is just absolutely fantastic. Right? This just heals you every time you kill someone, this is incredibly useful in the Crucible very specifically. So do keep that in mind, that you do have that absolutely huge boost there in terms of the Crucible, Shattered Realm. This is fantastic. I love this weapon. I don't necessarily exclusively use it with this one, and with this particular set, while I have used it with this set and had a blast, it's not my favorite weapon of this set, but this is absolutely delightful. But definitely something more intended for the Crucible. I find the Crucible to be the best place to use this. Even with the Shattered Realm, it's good for the first 3 shards of a... not shards. It's good for the first 3 chunks of a shard, but that 4th chunk is, bosses, so you don't necessarily have access to little flunkies that you can heal off of, so just kind of keep that in mind there. Then we have the Life Binder here. Very similar case. We have Wendigo Totem, Reaping Strike. If you wanted to go into a little bit of auto attacks without necessarily going full into Savagery, you could just grab Reaping Strike, splash that in, get a little bit of regular auto attack between your abilities. You can do that as well. Reaping Cascade is a nice little bonus damage that heals you. It's basically, it's kind of like an automated Drain Essence that just bounces from a couple of people. It's kind of how, or more like I would say, a Vitality Lightning Bolt kind of chaining to various enemies, I guess would be a better description. The Ugnabog Howler is for those who feel like they want a ranged option. This is Devouring Swarm and Siphon Souls. Now, the particularly interesting thing here is, of course, Devouring Swarm does a little bit more damage and reduces Vitality resistance even more, which, I mean, we're already getting some pretty impressive Vitality resistance reduction here. At 55 already, that's 12% more, and don't forget that with Monster Infrequents, like the Ugnabog Howler, you can get them to drop maybe something that enhances either Vitality damage more, or one of your other skills even more, so this has potentially even more use in context, depending on how lucky you are with your drops. This is something that you could absolutely farm if you are really interested in this. This is a great ranged option if you want to go with this. Also, clearly note the Vitality damage here, so this is fantastic. This is a metal that you can absolutely go into. Again, we're increasing Devouring Swarm here. You can definitely see a trend. Vitality and bleeding damage. Personally, my favorite skills to add on to with this set are from the Shaman, Devouring Swarm, and Wendigo Totem. For these reasons, you're already increasing Siphon Souls, you already have Siphon Souls, you could go into this Devouring Swarm even more, but this metal kind of tips it over for me, because if you'll notice, while we could go into the full of Bone Harvest, which I'm not really fond of personally in this build, we could go with the full Wendigo Totem here, we can go and then put the last of our points in Devouring Swarm. We have exactly 16 points, we have exactly 0 points. You can pull the 10 out of here and go into, say, Ill Omen if you really wanted to as well. That's a pretty good time. You've got 10 points there, or just leave them in there for the attribute points, or you could put 10 points into Reaping Strike. It's totally up to you, but you have this really nice clean usage of your points in that context, and I personally just really like that. It just feels like I've just completed a puzzle, for me personally. And then we have another, of course, metal that you can use. This one increases Reaping Strike. This one's very easy to get. You can just straight up buy it. Blood Pact increase, of course, that's for the Wendigo Totem. So you do have all of these great options. For melee weapons, Howl of the Wendigo is my favorite. I do enjoy the Siphon Souls boosts here. Another excellent choice would be the Mythical Spirit Crusher, of course. Would be my second favorite probably here. Bloodrender is really for fun. I won't necessarily go out and say it's the best one of the option, because personally this is just something I just have a lot of fun playing with. It's not necessarily the best option here, but it is something I have a lot of fun playing with. The rest of these, I generally don't like Bone Harvest in this set, so I don't usually use these. I have used them before with the set, so do keep that in mind. I have used these. This one is probably my favorite out of the ones that give you those bonuses. I think the Mythical Doomsaw of Gluttony is my least favorite, though, because it whatever this does is better done elsewhere. Spectral, if you're really a big fan of Spectral Wrath, this is really nice, but I'm just not as big of a fan of that. Not enough to go for Doomsaw over, say, Siphon Souls, which does do a lot of good. But that is the Ouroboros set. And again, this is kind of the groundwork for a lot of other sets that we are going to be talking about here. Now, I actually want to really quickly talk about the Dreadwalker, because there's a lot of similarities here. You are increasing Vitality and Aether damage, you are looking at increases to the Necromancer skills. It does have the Dreadwalker's Grace, which does heal you, so this is probably a little bit more effective in Hardcore. Okay, it comes with the weapon, and we're converting our Aether damage to Vitality, so this is much more heavier on the Vitality damage, which has its pros and cons. You definitely need the Will of Ratosh way more here. Drain Essence, Spectral Wrath, Mark of Torment, you can see a lot of the similar things going on. Spectral Binding, Hungering Reach. It's very similar. It just has Dreadwalker's Grace, really as a big... that's a really big change here. It's a little bit more effective for the... for Hardcore as a result of that, but it's got very similar context here. You can see the similar skills. You can see that the use of skills was very similar here. The Constellations, I would say that the Widow is not necessarily 100% needed here, because there is much less Aether damage going on. So if you wanted to divert that into, say, more bleeding damage out of the Fox, you can go right on ahead and do that. The only real difference is between the two is that because the Dreadwalker has the Dreadwalker Carver and the offhand, and also it's got fewer actual components, it is a little bit different to build in that context, so we're going to be ignoring all the weapon talk we had before. We also have of course, the Musalaux Pauldrons, because the Ouroboros set has shoulders and this one does not, so we actually have an opportunity to bust out these shoulders. Nothing particularly special here. An increase to Drain Essence, Devouring Swarm, so you can splash Devouring Swarm in there very cleanly. The Flesh Eater Leg Wraps, of course, we've already talked about. The Deadwalkers, we've already talked about for the obvious reasons. The Amulet here, again, the Ouroboros set has an amulet, so you can go into this if you want. We're talking about a Drain Essence increase. We were talking about Wendigo Totem. We were talking about Hungering, and you can see just beautifully for this setup here. There is a little bit of a cold damage increase that I don't usually utilize. That's fine. I'm really here for the increase in the Drain for Drain Essence and the increase in skills. Leeching Nova is really nice, especially if you happen to have high offensive ability, but this is a really fantastic time. Again, we're converting physical damage to vitality damage, which is, of course, not really that big of a deal because this is specifically doing Aether damage, so it's not going to get converted, but that's really a minor quibble that doesn't really matter at all. But I did want to talk about the Dreadwalker set because it's very similar to the Ouroboros. It's just got a different set skill, and it has a couple of different equipment options because it has fewer components, and it doesn't really need to worry about weapon as well. Let's talk very quickly about specifically Mogdragon's Peace, because we talked about this last time, and I do want to talk about this again. Again, this will be setting up a lot of the foundation for a lot of the various sets that deal with pets, but you're looking at Primal Bond here. Now, this is the only set available to you that specifies Primal Bond, so we are kind of leaning towards a hybrid here, but you don't necessarily have to. You can go full pet if you want to. It's very easy to set that up. But for Mogdragon's Tranquility, obviously, this is a heal. It just increases your pet damage. It's delightful. You can see we have huge increases to the Briarthorn. We've got maximum bleeding resistance, which is fairly interesting. We've got a nice bonus to pets here. You're going to see a lot of damage increases with this set. We've got Emboldening Presence and Ground Slam. Absolutely massive damage increase to all damage, which we can take advantage of, as we'll talk about with the various things as well. This isn't a heal, this is a max health increase, pardon me. I'm a derp. I'm recording this at 2:30 in the morning, so pardon me for a bit here. But this is a max health increase. This is not this is not a heal. Also, I also forgot to mention that this also increases your max Aether resistance, which is very nice. You've got here just pretty bog standard stuff here, more of the same. We're just increasing various pet resistances, damage, offensive ability, attack speed. These two are very, very standardized. Of course, we've got bleeding resistance here. So we've covered the set pretty roughly. Here's what it actually looks like using those specific components here. We've got the Briarthorn with all its accoutrements and Primal Bond. Now, how you necessarily want to approach the devotion points is weird, because you can do this a ton of different ways, and I've only set this up to kind of give you a broad illustration, but I've put in the Unknown Soldier for the physical and bleed damage that it can do, right? You could absolutely instead go into Azraka for the physical damage if you wanted to. You could devote yourself completely to the pets if you really wanted to. You could waltz up here and go into Korvac by splashing in green here, using the Lotus as a launching off point. You could go into any of these very easily. They all have blue and yellow. And this has blue and yellow as well, with some purple splashed in there as well. So it's very easy to do any combination of any of these four up here. These two, if you wanted to go into some lightning damage, it would be pretty easy to splash this. This has some blue source, this has some green. Which again you could combine with Korvac, so this is something that you can really play around a lot with. This isn't something I'm going to get hyper-specific with, because there's so many different constellations you can use effectively with this set, and there's a lot of different ways you can build this set to your advantage, because you'll notice that there's a huge amount of points available. I mean, I've maxed out Necromancer, but you wouldn't actually have that maxed out realistically. You would actually have 10 more points, because you would pull this back here. Oops. To at least here, if not farther back, depending on what you're doing. But you have a lot of different options here. For example, Xantarin's Mantle you could go into, that's Conjure Primal Spirit. Now, again, a quick note, I'm not a big fan of the Primal Spirit. The only time I really consistently use the Primal Spirit is when the rest of my pets are dead and I need an emergency pet, or I'm fighting a boss or a hero and I need some extra damage. That's when I'll bust out the Primal Spirit, but it's not something I'm going to normally use in regular combat. It's not a permanent pet, so I'm not a huge fan of this, personally. I usually will go for this, because this will actually increase Primal Bond. It gives you some Vitality damage increases, so if you wanted to splash in specifically the Wendigo Totem or Siphon Souls to take advantage of the Vitality damage increase and the bleeding, because don't forget, the Primal Bond increases your physical and bleeding damage, right? So if you wanted to splash in Wendigo Totem for the bleeding, that would be fine. That'd be very easy to manage with this. You can straight up purchase this. It's very easy to get your hands on, and it will do you a lot of good. Alright, then we have the Wildshorn Leg Guards. This has Call of the Grave, which is a really interesting subject to talk about, because you can use this without pets. This just boosts acid, vitality, and poison damage, you know, across the board. Boosts all the damage your pets are doing. It lasts 10 seconds, 24-second recharge, of course. That doesn't change as it levels up, just the amount of damage it increases goes up. It's really, really nice. I do use that more often than not with pets, and the actual benefits you're getting to your pets is quite interesting, especially the poison and acid retaliation damage. That's very impressive. Of course, Emboldening Presence increase, the Emboldening Presence being a huge deal, and the reason why I'm not sure I mentioned this in the previous part, but the reason why I often use pets with allies, I use it in a multiplayer context, is because, at the very least with the Ritualist, I can bust out an Emboldening Presence Briarthorn and increase my allies as well. So what I'll often do is, if I'm playing multiplayer with friends, I'll often go ranged, run, at the very least, the Briarthorn with full Emboldening Presence, and have, you know, one of my allies is probably, whether it be a friend, a family, whoever, it will probably be running melee, and they can benefit off of the Briarthorn. But if you're playing solo, I do recommend you play melee, just so you can take advantage of this. This is quite the impressive buff. You've got physical resistance there, you have increased offensive ability, plus 50% to all your damage. It's very nice. We'll talk about that later. Of course, with this particular set, you obviously are going melee, but with pet builds in general, I will usually use these with allies for that reason. Ranged obviously would be with other builds, but it's something I do actually utilize quite decently often. But, you know, besides that, the pants have really nice physical resistance. Again, we've got great damage increases here, some interesting retaliation here, which is always a good time. You also, if you don't want to go for necessarily the Wildshorn Leg Guards, you've got the Reaper's Leg Guards. This is specifically Soul Harvest and Blood Pact. Right, now Soul Harvest is particularly interesting because Soul Harvest boosts your pets. So if you want to actually really commit to the hybrid here, and you want to go Call of the Grave, this is increasing vitality damage. The Poison Acid you're not really going to do anything with, but if you wanted to just increase the vitality damage of your pets, you can absolutely do that. With this particular set, I'm not really as inclined to do this. I'm more likely to do this with a couple of other sets we're going to be talking about in the future, but it's an option if you really want to. I'm more likely to go with the Wildshorn leggings, because again, emboldening presence increases, which is really nice. We've got Call of the Grave, which is a really huge benefit as well. These rings, this is just fantastic. Alright, you've got a lot of jewelry that you can run with this set, but you've got just increase to Briarthorn, increase to Skeletons. The Skeletons, of course, being a great pickup for this. Keep in mind that the Skeletons are going to randomly be melee or ranged, but the melee ones will benefit a lot from the emboldening presence of your Briarthorn, so it is a really great thing to at least consider as well. We have the Crimson Briar Band, which increases Primal Bond specifically, as well as Will of the Crypt. Now, Will of the Crypt is very specifically... Nope, it's this one. This is the just damage boost to the Skeletons. This is probably the one... With this specific set, this is the one I'm going to go more into. First off, it increases your bleeding damage. Second off, it improves Primal Bond. Third off, it gives you Will of the Crypt. So this is usually... I'm going to try and double up on these rings. Get +4 to Primal Bond. Get +4 to Will of the Crypt. Get even more bleeding damage in there. I'll try and usually double up on this. Sometimes I'll do a combination of these two. It really depends on how I feel, what my resistances are on my other pieces of equipment, etc. How many monster frequencies I'm using and how predictable those are, all that other stuff. But this is usually the one that I'm going to have at least one of these equipped on this specific set. I'm more likely to use the other rings with other sets, but both are excellent, and don't be afraid of using either of them. We also have this one. This is probably my least favorite of the rings that I've talked about so far. First off, I don't often incorporate large amounts of Aether damage into this particular set. Second off, Conjure Primal Spirit, as I've already discussed, is my least favorite pet. Reeve Spirit is really nice. The fact that it actually increases that is pretty huge. The problem I have with Reeve Spirit, at least in a Primal Bond-focused pet build, is that it costs you basically an extra 10 points just to get to Reeve Spirit, so I don't often even go for it then. So this is my least favorite ring for those reasons, just specifically. So, just, you know, if you really want to go into that because you want to convert your skeleton damage to vitality damage, your skeleton mages, excuse me, very specifically, that's fine. And if you really like Reap Spirit, I really love Reap Spirit. It's a great skill. But it's in this context, I think it's too expensive. And again, the Primal Spirit is not something I'm really fond of, so I'd rather use a ring that I'm actually going to use, like Will of the Crypt with Primal Bond. I'm actually going to use those skills. I'm not really likely to use Primal Spirit. Ugol's Icor, or Icor, depending on how you want to pronounce that. This is really... This is for those of you who want to go with a hybrid pet and self, and want to specifically go into the admittedly very useful Ravenous Earths. You can go into Decay and Foul Eruption, right? Because you're increasing your acid and poison damage there, you're increasing Foul Eruption here. That is what this is very specifically doing, okay? This isn't the set I usually use this with, but you can, alright? And, you know, again, you're already getting a increased maximum vitality resistance. Ravenous Earth is a fantastic ability, and it's, of course, you're increasing Primal Bond, so you're getting that benefit. It's just not what I particularly use in this combination. Then we have the Conjuring Seal. This is usually a stopgap I use this as, because really you can purchase this straight up. I'll usually use this if I don't necessarily have access to my rings at the time, or I'm doing a really pure improv and I'm not pulling my items out of other sets. So if you're looking to improv, this is nice, a nice thing to just splash in there for some boosted damage to your pets and a bit more skeletons, especially since you can very easily purchase 2 of these and double up on these. Or if you're currently farming for a second one of these rings, or any one of these rings, this is a really great stopgap ring that you can just purchase, throw that on, off you go. That's basically, I just wanted to mention that really quick here. Pardon me. And then we have the Wendigo Gaze. This is a metal, of course. This is increasing the Briar Thorns. This gives you another skeleton, which is great. This also gives you +3 to Undead Legion, which is very likely because that is specifically what's giving you some of them. This is actually very likely going to give you at least 2 extra skeletons. So that's a lot of fun if you really love spamming skeletons. It is a lot of fun to play with. I won't necessarily say it's the single best metal, considering that there are other metals to compete, and that really depends on your personal preference. But it's a load of fun playing with like 8 skeletons or more running around. It's a laugh. Um, and again, as a monster infrequent, you can farm up for a better version of this that potentially increases your Briarthorn more, increases your skeletons more, or increases some other ability even more. So it is very easy to get an even better version of this. Just remember that this is the default stats. Then we have the Blood Binding. I'm not even going to try to pronounce that. But this is just, again, something you can splash in if you really want to go heavy hybrid. You get Siphon Souls in there, you get Devouring Swarm. Right? So you have that as well available to you. Along with the leg guards, by the way, that you can run as well. Then we have the Mark of Manipulation. This just increases your raised skeletons. This is also something you can purchase. This increases your damage more, though, so this is a bit more towards the hybrid idea than, say, the Wendigo Gaze, which, while it does increase your stats, really primarily is giving you Pierce Resistance. While this could increase a skill that you personally can use, this is more of a surefire, hey, this is a combination item for myself and my pets. And then finally, we have the Mythical Mark of Bloody Ends. This one's interesting because it tacks, as I've stated before, this tacks on some bleeding damage to the Blight Fiend, which is really nice. This increases your bleeding damage. Again, this is really heavily into the hybrid version. It also gives you +2 to Rape Spirit. This would be I use this occasionally, but it's still not my favorite of the metals. I think my favorite still has to be the Wendigo Gaze, because again, I think in this context Reap Spirit is a little too expensive, but that's just my opinion. So but it is an excellent metal to use if you want to go into that. So let's talk about the last few sets, because there is not necessarily a whole lot left that are going to be doing anything particularly weird. I want to get into the Bismiel's Trinkets. Even though there's a huge amount of items up here, this isn't really one of my favorite sets to use with this combination. I have used it once, and it was pretty wild. You are specifically only really getting benefits to Call of the Grave and Emboldening Presence throughout. You can clearly see that this is kind of pretty equally applied to Occultist, Shaman, or Necromancer. I mean, you get some great damage increases here, and if you're wondering to yourself, yes, you can kind of equip these. You can see that there's an amulet here and a metal here, and a lot of the other pet sets have either a metal or an amulet, so it's very difficult to combine both sets completely. But this is also something you can slap on top of some, maybe some Monster Infrequent pieces that you have, or some stuff you forged, if you really want to. It's not necessarily far out there. Bismiel's Authority is actually really nice, because this is actually a heal. So that's just really nice as well. It also heals allies around you. This is really nice if you're working with allies. You get just plus 8% health for yourself, and the rest of this is for your pets. The primary reason why I'm not the biggest fan of this is because this is giving some pretty feeble stat bonuses to your pets. I mean, the physical resistance is really nice, but the really mild amounts of elemental damage over time is kind of pathetic. It really applies a lot more to Occultist, but I have played with this once. There is, of course, here's the actual setup here. You've got Call of the Grave, you've got the Briarthorn. This one I just demonstrated that you can go really gung-ho into the pet increasing setup here. I've got the Raven here, the Spider for the green. I've got the Crane here for the pet increases in the yellow. I've got the Sailor's Guide for the blue. Again, you can mix and match this as you please, but I just wanted to prove to you that you can go into 3 of these pet boosting builds. I skipped this one because this is fire damage and just not really anything that you're going to do with this combination. This would be a bit more applicable for the Occultist if you chose to go into that instead. We'll talk about that eventually down the road. But yeah, for all intents and purposes, nah. You can go into this if you really want to. It does offer you some good benefits. It's just not something that I feel is better for this particular setup here. There's some great resistances, but the fire damage is just not something you're going to use. You have a lot of items here that you can utilize that maybe the other sets can't use because they have those slots filled in with other pieces of their set. So this is much more of a customizable build. For example, here we've got the Spectral Crown. You can of course. I really bring this up not necessarily for any other reason, but because this is a monster infrequent, and you can get one that increases something for shamans. Of course, that takes some farming, but it does increase the raised skeletons. The Ascendant Cowl is much more of a better choice, obviously, because it is making it faster to summon Briarthorns, which is a little bit more useful in the Crucible and the Shattered Realm, where Briarthorn is more likely to die. It gives 4 skeletons. Although I think this is... Well, it reads it gives 4 skeletons. This is actually a typo. This is actually +4 to summon raised skeletons, so it's actually just +4 to the skill. You're more likely to actually... You're pretty likely to get at least 1 extra skeleton, probably 2 out of this. +3 to Undead Legion, so 2 to 3 extra skeletons. Good benefit to pets here. Then we have the Vile Headguard. You can straight purchase this, which is why this is mentioned here. This is, again, another stopgap in case you want to farm for the others. Farm for this, perhaps. I'll actually get rid of this. I just wanted to mention that casually. If you're farming for this, you can buy this in the meantime. It is pretty beneficial. Primal Spirit is, again, not my favorite thing. We have the Ravager's Dreadgaze. If you decide to go into Primal Bond with this setup, this is really nice for that kind of hybrid +1 to all skills, so everything you and your pets do is going to be boosted because, hey, I'm boosting all of these skills. It was just worth mentioning really quick. The Necrolord's Gaze, of course, we've got Conjure Primal Spirit. This one's actually one of the few times I'll use the Primal Spirit, and I actually use the Primal Spirit fairly extensively in this build for this particular reason, because it actually lives for, I think, 20 seconds, and you have a shorter recharge for this. I believe it lives for 20 seconds. Let me double check that. Lives for, nope, or it lives for 20 seconds. It just lives for 24 seconds, and it takes 40 seconds to recharge. So, you know, it is, in context, very nice. Again, this is more about if you go Primal Bond. This is very useful. You're increasing your Aether damage. You've got Mark of Torment here if you really want to go into that. The Circlet of the Great Serpent is probably my slightly more preferred one, because, again, we can go into Primal Bond here already. We have +2 to Blight Fiend. We've got all skills to Shaman. We have faster summoning skeletons, which again is more useful in, say, the Crucible or the Shattered Realm, and we get extra acid damage on the Blight Fiend. And of course, our pets are doing extra poison acid damage, and this is really huge. There aren't very many enemies that can take control of your minions, but they do exist, and of course, the Shattered Realm and the Crucible have random enemies showing up all over the place, so it's entirely possible you'll find, you know, it's not only possible, it's very likely at some point you're going to run across these. So this particular benefit right here is absolutely huge, because if you come across one of these heroes or bosses in the Shattered Realm or in the Crucible, and they control your pets, you're in some pretty big trouble, alright? So, this is actually really huge as well. If I'm going to be taking a pet build using this set into the Shattered Realm or the Crucible, I'm probably going to be equipping this. This is one of the big benefits of this particular set here, is the fact that you can equip that and still have the full set. The other sets that do pets have a headgear, so that's very tough. Of course, we have Xanthrin's Mantle again. We've already talked about this. We've talked about a lot of these. You're going to see a lot of repeats here. This is a torso piece that we didn't talk about because the other sets have torso pieces, but this is Devouring Swarm plus Raised Skeletons. Of course, your skeletons do vitality damage, so Devouring Swarm can really help them out. It is worth mentioning there. We have the Fiendmaster Raiment, which gives you Reap Spirit, Ground Slam. If you're going Master of Death, this is probably the ideal way to go, because Fiendmaster is just something you can slap on and massively boost your pets. You're already going to be at max Necromancer for Master of Death, so Reap Spirit is already going to be within your grasp. So if you're going with the Master of Death version of this... wait, I've lost... There it is. If you're going with the Master of Death version, you're already going to be right there. Why not go into Reap Spirit? You know, it's a great thing. Mythical Touch of Command, again, other sets have handguards. Master of Death increase here, which helps the previous torso piece. Emboldening Presence, increasing your pets even more. This particular build I prefer using Master of Death on, by the way. I never actually mentioned whether I prefer Primal Bond or Master of Death here. This is a Master of Death preference for me. Again, that helmet is a huge deal. It does Primal Bond too, but I will often actually just go into Master of Death, pretend this doesn't exist, and go into this for the reduced mind control duration. But I am usually going to go into Master of Death. Ground Slam and Undead Legion, other great gloves here. Which one of these gloves you want is really up to you. I personally prefer the Master of Death boost, so I usually go with the Touch of Command, but the Deathrite handguards are great. It's also, keep in mind, that going to increase the damage of your pets, whereas this is going to increase their durability and their attack speed and their move speed. We have the Wildthorn leggings, we've talked about those, we've talked about these. The Crypt Stalker, we get to talk about weapons now. The Crypt Stalker is, again, really kind of for the Master of Death here. We've got plus Reap Spirit, we've got plus to all other skills in Necromancer. This is fairly interesting. The aura here is going to really benefit you and your pets, even if you're not going to Spectral Binding. You still have a kind of weaker Spectral Wrath, I should say, that's actually incredibly effective. And if you go into Spectral Wrath on top of this, it's even better. So do keep that in mind, that that's quite the interesting little combination there. This is, of course, basically in basic function, it works from the top half here very similarly, where you're just increasing your skeletons and your Briarthorn, you're increasing your pets, but the fact that you can get a Devourer, of which you can have up to 3, and they just do random chaos damage. Now, I don't necessarily go into this very heavily, because obviously you're not really increasing chaos damage, you're not really doing chaos damage, so for this particular set with this class, with the Ritualist, I don't often use this, but it is worth mentioning. Then we have the Soul Carver, we have Blood Pact, we have Bone Harvest, we have Vitality Wave. This is really if you want to go hybrid. Again, we've got the Wendigo Totem, which will heal your minions, which is really nice. We've got Bone Harvest, which will boost your minions, so that's very effective for those reasons. We have the Soul Bearer. We've talked about this before as well. Again, Soul Harvest here is primarily the reason why Wendigo Totem. How the Wendigo, similar kind of scenario. This is just for the hybrid here. We've got Blood Pact. A lot of this is going to be pretty similar. This one's fairly interesting, because this is poison acid damage. Again, this isn't the set that I usually use this with, but it is a fairly interesting twist from the usual. Then we have an interesting combination that I like to occasionally do. Let me talk first about the Mythical Lick Guard, which increases your Blight Fiend and your raised skeletons, increases your pets, and gives you this really excellent passive that'll just save your life a lot of the time. Yes, it's got a pretty long skill recharge, but it's really incredibly effective, and just an absolute delight to use. This will actually keep you alive a lot, and if you're going to be running pets in hardcore, I would suggest maybe using the Lick Guard, because that is very useful for that, and you can run the Totally Normal Arbiter, increase all of your skills across the board, and whether or not you splash in some Aether damage from your Necromancer if you're going hybrid, or if you're not going hybrid and you're just splashing in 1 or 2 skills, or you're just relying on the Aether Cascade, these work really well together. It's worth considering. You're not necessarily going to do personally as much damage, but if you're really going dedicated for that hardcore pet build, this can really be nice. The Bound Wraith is another offhand that you can potentially use, obviously. Conjure Primal Spirit. This isn't my favorite way to use Primal Spirit, but if you're already going to be using it because of the because of Necrolord's Gaze, I would really suggest the Bound Wraith, because that'll make your Primal Spirit even better at attacking, and you can recharge. You can use it even more frequently. I believe that's a -8. No, that is a -13-second cooldown. What is the default cooldown of this again? The default is 45, so 13. So that's down to good old 32. Which is really impressive. But you can also run this, of course, huge benefits to pets. And again, it is a monster infrequent. You can get even more out of this. The Bloodsworn Codex. This is for that Briarthorn. This is really nice offhand if you want to increase your pets. You want to really buff your Briarthorn, but you want to go hybrid. You're only really using the Briarthorn for the Emboldening Presence. This is a great offhand to use. This, of course, the Grimoire. This increases Soul Harvest and Undead Legion. This is, again, more towards the hybrid, because you can use Soul Harvest to boost yourself and your pets. You've got the Revenant of Ognepesh, which is, of course, another pet, which does fire damage. Not my favorite offhand to use, because, again, you're not really necessarily doing a whole lot of fire damage with this class. So I don't usually use this with the Shaman Necromancer. I did try it, and I really didn't like it, because I just wasn't boosting the Revenant quite as much as I would other pets, so I did eventually switch this off. the Gate to Many Worlds. I'll be honest, this is the only offhand that I've talked about so far with this set that I have not personally used with this set. I don't know why, but I just haven't. But from what I can see here, you've got nice Call to Grave. Oakskin, which, I mean, if you're going to go into Oakskin, which is this one right here, you're getting a bonus to your pets for physical damage with Magdragon's Pact. But I probably wouldn't necessarily go out of my way for this. The bonus to pets is huge, and the good old World Gate is fairly impressive here, but keep in mind also that there's not a heavy amount of elemental damage going on here either, so I would like to try this eventually, and I will get around to doing that at some point. This is the only offhand, like I said, I haven't used with this set, or I haven't used at all, actually. I don't remember ever using Gate to Many Worlds. I remember this one. And I just don't really see this necessarily being that useful in the context of the Ritualist, compared to other offhands that you could use instead. Even the Bloodsworn Codex you could get some pretty big boosts out of. Bound Wraith. I just don't find this as appealing as those, personally. The Guillotine, again, this is more along the lines of the hybrid build, because you get +2 to all Soldier and Necromancer skills, so no matter how you run this, but particularly with Primal Bond, which is obviously what you'd be picking up if you were going to be using the hybrid anyways, because bleeding. And of course Revel in Death, which is even more bleeding, and some health. Just something I wanted to randomly mention. I don't use this very often with this, but I have tried it once. It was pretty good, but I wouldn't necessarily recommend using this. But if you really wanted to go with a two-handed weapon in a hybrid build with Primal Bond, this is not a bad choice. The Troll Bone Crusher would probably... a good level 94 Troll Bone Crusher that you're lucky enough to get a really good one that maybe boosts pets, or maybe boosts some specific pet through increasing its skill points, or gives you, additions to whatever. This is potentially better for you than the Guillotine, depending on what you roll for its suffixes and prefixes. And then the Spirit Cannon. Again, this is something you might want to use with the hybrid, because you are getting cold damage here, so you could get yourself a nice Bone Harvest increase there with that cold and vitality damage. You've got, of course, increased to skeletons and all of the Necromancer and Shaman skills, right? So that is the good old Bismiel's Trinkets. Now, I'm going to primarily be covering a lot of these other pieces much faster, because we've covered kind of the main primary ground here. Ghoul's Malice is particularly interesting because it is specifically looking to give your pets poison acid damage. We've got the Blight Fiend, we've got Magdragon's Pact. Here's what it looks like with all of the skills that it actually increases across the whole set. Right, you've got Devouring Swarm, decreasing poison acid resistance, the Eldritch Talon, decreasing poison acid resistance. The actual set itself gives you maximum elemental resistance here, Soul Harvest increase here, which I actually didn't show you. Yeah, it did actually. Now you'll notice that there's 0 points here. You would have to actually sacrifice a little bit of something here to really make this work fully. What you would want to sacrifice, I don't know, but you would want to go into either Primal Bond or Master of Death, but do keep that in mind. I didn't choose either of them because I wasn't sure necessarily what you would want. But theoretically, you can get away without using any of those as well, if you were feeling particularly spicy, right? So, you're getting a lot of damage increases, poison acid increases, increases to all your damage. You have the Eldritch Web Weaver, which does, more poison acid damage. And really, we've already talked about pretty much all of these, I keep bringing that up. We've talked about all these items very recently. There are a couple of very specific points that I want to make very clear here. First off, this is even more effective under this build because you have the access to the poison acid. You will notice that the Goals set does not have a helmet. So under this set, the actual mythical circlet of the Great Serpent, besides having the Great Mind Control Reduction, also increases poison and acid damage. So this is very definitely my favorite set to use this with. Beyond that, we've talked about the rest of this primarily. There's a couple of other... Oh, this one. This, again, also increases poison acid damage, so this is my favorite single-hand weapon for this set. We've talked about most of the rest of these. The jewelry, of course, which we have access to. The amulets. This one is Master of Death, if you wanted to go with that instead of Primal Bond. Beyond that, the Death Watcher pendant is also quite interesting. Mogdragon's Pact, which you already have. Some extra bonuses to Call of the Grave, if you want to go into that. Or you probably will already have. You don't necessarily need to go into that specifically. But, yeah, you can absolutely go in. What offhand you use necessarily with the Scorpius Pummeler is entirely up to you. I have used both of these, of course. The Briar Thorn is personally my favorite because, again, you've already got points in that, and it's already there. You're increasing physical damage. It's a nice time. Again, you can, both of those are monster infrequents, so you can get that, even more potential benefits out of those, but I just wanted to really cover the specific differences between this and the Bismiel set. The Bismiel set laying down a lot of, again, more ground rules. The Constellation here is also not really, in this particular instance, I went with this, and then I kind of splashed in the Ratosh, the Veil Warden. But you, again, with this particular set, just like with the last one, you can do any kind of combination. It depends on if you're going Primal Bond or Master of Death. Obviously, if you're going Master of Death, you're going way more for a lot of these, like I demonstrated previously. Or if you're going for a hybrid, you would probably want to go into Korvac, and maybe you would want to go into a bit more of the poison acid damage side of things. Maybe you want to go into Ugol, which gives you vitality and poison acid and cold damage, which is really great, by the way. But you've seen a lot of the constellations before. This is just something I kind of crammed together to prove that you can go on to complete opposite sides here. Especially since the set itself, actually also just, it doesn't really care what you do damage-wise, it'll just increase it. So you have pretty free reign to kind of go ballistic, but I just wanted to talk about that very specifically in that context. Beyond that, a lot of the other sets have somewhat specifically differences here. For example, the Veil Keeper is specifically increasing lightning and aether damage, and besides that, we've got the reduced stun and freeze duration, which is really helpful. We're adding extra lightning damage to Upheaval. Upheaval is now stunning people. We have aether damage to Reaping Strike. We're stunning people with Reaping Strike. You can see a very definite trend here of auto-attacking, right? And then we have physical resistance here, which is really nice. We've got aether damage to Upheaval, electric damage to Upheaval, aether damage to Necrotic Edge. Necrotic Edge just does aether damage and lightning damage, right? So this is actually specifically what it looks like. We've got the Upheaval here, we've got Reaping Strike, we've got Necrotic Edge, we've got Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath, which is, of course, increased down here. We've got increased attack speed to Spectral Binding and Spectral Wrath. Now, to actually discuss the set specifically, by the way, first off, obviously, the Widow is highly important here. You can easily get both Ultos and Ratosh here as well. Ratosh is a little less important here. Yes, he does do aether damage, which is nice, but you don't necessarily do a ton of vitality damage in this set. You'll notice there's no specific increases for vitality damage. Cold damage is changed to aether damage, which we don't really care too much about. But you could go into... Tsunami is a little bit interesting under that condition anyways. So you do have those options, so to speak. This is actually fairly interesting, the Chains of Brandis, where you can convert that vitality damage to lightning damage. This is pretty much the only set that I'll really talk about this with, but you do have that very interesting concept, and then from there you can boost the lightning damage, of course. So that's fairly useful as well. We have the Mythical Astral Leg Wraps, which increases Spectral Wrath. Primal Strike, of course, which does lightning damage, which you're increasing, so Primal Strike is a really great thing, especially with that stun there. That's a good time. It increases lightning and aether damage, of course. Random chance to avoid melee attacks, which is extremely nice. We have the Bone Shatter Treads. Now, this one is Devouring Storm and Reaping Strike. Primarily Reaping Strike, but the Devouring Storm isn't necessarily bad either. This is the increase to physical damage, which, if you're using Upheaval, you're going to have some physical damage anyways. The Vitality damage boosts the Reaping Strike, technically. So this is a really nice pair of shoes for this. For weapons, you could actually go with the Totally Normal Arbiter, which is increasing lightning and aether damage. Again, I usually will go with, if I am going to use this, the good old Storm Scourge Bulwark here. We've got the Storm Totem and the Stormcaller's Pact, which of course the Stormcaller's Pact increases lightning damage, so it's a really strong choice here. If you don't want to go into Stormcaller's Pact, probably avoid these two, even though they look basically like the same shield, which is really funny. If you don't want to go with the shield, you want to go with the offhand, maybe you want to go with... I'll be talking about the weapons for this one a little bit later, but those are Monster and Frequency, which we'll be talking about next episode. I don't want to extend this too far. But you can also go into this for Stormcaller's Pact, Storm Totem, more lightning damage, right? This is somewhat similar. This is if you decided to go with a hybrid build here, if you really wanted to. I don't usually. I tried it once and I really didn't like it. Just being really honest. But this is, if you wanted to go hybrid with this particular setup, with this particular set, you could, with the Stormbringer of Malmoth. Just keep in mind that I wasn't a big fan. Then we have the Vortex of Souls, which is really nice if you're not sure where you want to take it, because this is purely... this works really well with Primal, with the Astral Leg Wraps, because this is actually able to use Primal Strike. A lot of the other things aren't, so this is usually what I go to with this, especially since it's just +2 to Necromancer, +2 to Shaman. Doesn't matter what you build, it's boosting it. It does Aether damage, which are already increasing. It actually fires its regular attacks for Aether damage, which is really nice. And again, you can use Primal Strike with this. This works really well with the Astral Leg Wraps. This is probably my default weapon to go with in this. I'll be talking about some other alternatives to this set with the Monster and Frequency in the next episode, the next part, but this is usually my go-to for this set. And then the Ring of Anubar, which increases cold damage, which of course is going to get converted anyways, but mostly it's the increase to lightning damage, a conversion back, but really what we're talking about here is the Eye of Anubar, which does increase lightning damage here, and increases, again, Primal Strike, and you've also got increases to Nether Edge, which, again, when you're using a two-handed weapon, I'll usually go into both Primal Strike and Savagery for this, and go really, I'll basically just Primal Strike, and then shoot them just ballistically, and then if they get close, then I just rely on Spectral Wrath and everything, and I'll go into Stormcaller's Pact for this. But that's usually how I approach this set. I'm going through these last sets kind of quickly, not only because the video is kind of long, but again, we've already laid down a lot of the kind of basics here. Actually, there's only two sets left I want to talk about. We have the Armor of the Eternal Night. This is, of course, the cold and vitality setup here. We've got lightning damage being converted to cold damage. We have piercing damage being converted to vitality damage, which doesn't really affect this this class that much because there's not a whole lot of pierce damage between the two of them. Lightning damage being converted to cold, pierce damage being converted to cold. Now, again, you have kind of, just like with the previous one where I prefer Stormcaller's Pact. Actually, let me go back to that really quick. This isn't the one. This is the set, the Veilkeeper set. You can theoretically go into either Stormcaller's Pact or Harbinger of Souls and do really well. I just prefer Stormcaller's Pact because I like to use Primal Strike and Savagery, and I don't have to, like, worry about the lightning damage not being increased. It's just a personal preference of mine. You can absolutely 100% go into Harbinger of Souls if you want. It's just a preference for me to use Stormcaller's Pact. It's kind of the same thing with the Armor of the Eternal Night. Yeah. You can actually go into either the Stormcaller's Pact for the boost in cold, or you can go into the Harbinger of Souls for the boost in vitality. For this one, because Harbinger of Souls boosts vitality a little bit more than Aether, and because Stormcaller's Pact boosts lightning a little bit more than cold, and that lightning is being converted into cold, I usually will go with the Harbinger of Souls on this one. Again, personal preference. A lot of these we're going to have seen before. Actually, let me really quickly talk about the stats here. Again, this is actually fairly interesting because the Hand of Ultos is still going to be reducing elemental resistances, which is really nice. And the lightning damage it's going to be doing is converted to cold anyways, so it's just, you know, you get your vitality in there, you get your lightning and cold in there. This is, of course, Wendigo Totem, Hungering Reach. Now, there's a key interesting thing here with the Hungering Reach in that you can actually convert that to cold. You can make this pure cold and vitality, which is a really big deal for this set. So do keep that in mind, that you can really make Drain Essence very strong under those circumstances with this, just by doing that, by putting in that 1 point here in Grave Chill. So you can really get a huge benefit out of that. Which is actually why I really like Hungering Reach here. The Flesh Eater leg wraps. Wendigo Totem, of course, Vitality and Bleeding is just a nice time. This is more for if you really want to use the Bone Harvest, which is probably the only context that I'll use this in a single player build with this. Usually I'll try and use Bone Harvest with pets. That's how I prefer to use it, because I like to take advantage of that. It's mild efficiency obsession I have, but with this set, because of the increase to cold and vitality, I'm actually not quite as concerned with that, so this actually can do you a lot of good there, especially with Devouring Swarm increases as well. Reaper's Leg Guard we've talked about. We've got Soul Harvest and Blood Pact. So, you know, again, Soul Harvest is the final stage of the Bone Harvest. Deadwalker Footpads, we've talked about that. You know what that's about. You know what a lot of these are about, except for this weapon. This weapon is pretty big because not only is it increasing Reaping Strike and Necrotic Edge, but it actually increases cold damage as well. So this is one of my favorite items to actually utilize for this set. It's one of the few... this is probably the most unique weapon that I'm going to be recommending in this video set-wise, because this is actually one of the few that just increases cold damage for the shaman part as well. A lot of the cold damage increasing weapons for the necromancer are either are usually with necromancer combined with something else, and in that particular context, why would you want to use something that isn't increasing everything you're doing compared to something that why would you use something that isn't increasing everything you're doing when you have so many different options for things that will increase everything you're doing? But the Mythical Notched Bone of 1,000 Deaths actually increases Reaping Spirit and Necrotic Edge, which you're already using, and increases cold damage and pierce damage if you wanted to go into Bone Harvest as well. That's a pretty big actual deal, and the fact that it itself does pierce damage itself actually makes this really relevant, because then when you actually talk about the piercing damage being converted to vitality damage and your actual increases to vitality damage due to the Harbinger of Souls, this particular weapon becomes very potent indeed. So this is actually a really cool recommendation that I can do, and this is usually the weapon I'm going to go to for this set. I mean, there are the other options, of course. We've talked about the Soul Carver before, we've talked about a lot of these other ones before, but that one's my absolute favorite. Another interesting point here is, because this is specifically a single-hand weapon, I usually will bust out the Night Shard. Again, we're talking about vitality and cold damage increases, poison acid if you're really into it. Siphon Souls does cold resistance if you want to splash into that. Also has doubles its duration, so again, you can constantly be refreshing that. This is also especially interesting if you wanted to splash in Ravenous Earth, which you absolutely could do as well. I don't necessarily always go all the way with that, but it is something you can absolutely do. It's very interesting. You can also go with the Totally Normal Arbiter if you wanted to use that instead of the Notched Bone, but I usually use the Notched Bone. As nice as the Lightning I'll usually use this if I'm going to be going into Stormcaller's Pact instead. That's a really good combination there. We also have this shield, the Chillblood's Carcass. If you're really dedicated to the Bone Harvest, this is the better choice here. Also, it increases Raging Tempest, which we're already going to be increasing via the set here. You'll notice Raging Tempest right here, which decreases enemy elemental resistance, which is nice for your cold damage. But you also have this as well. Again, this is a monster infrequent, so you can theoretically get better versions of this that increase some other skill. You also have this, of course. This is Vitality damage, increases Bone Harvest. Again, Devouring Swarm, which is always really nice as well. This is in case you want to do a two-handed version. Spectral Wormwall is just another version, basically, but it gives you Wendigo Totem, faster Wendigo Totems. It gives you Vitality Resistance drop through Siphon Souls. So again, this actually massively increases the duration of Siphon Souls, where this will actually last longer than its cooldown, because it already has a 3-second default duration. This brings it up to 8, but it has a 6-second skill recharge, so you can actually have this constantly running around you, which is very interesting. So this is a great two-handed option as well, probably a little bit more my favorite than the Corvin Reaping Halberd, just because of this, but it's really a choice between which one you prefer more. Of course, the Mythical Spirit Cannon, if you decide to splash in even just skeletons, would make this worth it. Great cold vitality ranged weapon. This, of course, we've talked about. This is a little bit better on this one than the previous set we talked about because this is more about cold damage. We increase Primal Strike and Nether Edge here, which is really nice as well. Another benefit, by the way, of the Spectral Wormhole is that you can bust out Primal Strike if you really want to. This, of course, Cold Vitality damage increases, Drain Essence, which, again, as I mentioned, you can turn into Cold and Vitality damage, which is really nice. And you've got all of these great benefits here for that reason. And, of course, it increases Hungering Reach, Drain Essence. We've talked about that before. Talked about this before, Siphon Souls, if you want to go into that, Devouring Swarm as well, and the Slail Mark of Blood, which you can straight up buy, so this is a nice stopgap if you want just to have something while you're looking for either this or this if you want those more, or you could just keep this. This is very effective as well. And then, finally, all we're really going to talk about is the Dark One's Gifts, which is a very odd specific set where it is really increasing your poison acid damage, right? So it looks kind of like this. You've got Wendigo Totem, and you've got the Ravenous Earth for Devotion. This is actually one where you kind of want to go for Ugol and Ratosh very specifically, like I mentioned earlier. That's very effective here. And then this is also quite the interesting little item here, because a lot of the sets, again, have gloves. This isn't really super important because it isn't increasing any of the damage types you're actually increasing otherwise, Acid and Vitality, but it is, nice to increase the Wendigo Totem here and Blood Boiled if you decide to go into Siphon Souls. But this is really nice. Again, we are talking about Poison Acid. You have increased Devouring Swarm. You've got maximum Poison Acid resistance, +1 to all skills of Necromancer. I almost always use this belt with this set. I mean, they basically are made for each other. We've talked about these. A lot of these other ones here. Nothing really particularly different here other than this. Increasing Ravenous Earth. This is actually usually the weapon I will go in for just because it allows me to spam Ravenous Earth and it spams much better, and also the Devouring Swarm increase goes really well with the Mythical String of Maggots. So I do really like the Bone Spike here, especially when you consider the fact that the Ravenous Earth does not care about your weapon. So there is no need for weapon damage increases. Same thing with the Wendigo Totem. Same thing with the Devouring Swarm. They don't care about what your weapon damage is, so you can go absolutely gung-ho with the Bone Spike, not really have to worry about your weapon damage here, and just go absolutely ballistic. Beyond that, again, we're just going to be talking about some standouts here, such as this one. Again, this is an offhand. Again, this is what I'll usually use my offhand with the Bone Spike. Poison Acid Vitality. The acid damage converted to Vitality isn't really a big deal. The Aether damage being converted into Vitality is really nice. You've got Spectral Binding here if you really want to go into that. You've got +1 to all things Shaman. You have a faster Wendigo Totem, and the best part, actually, is this. Bonus Poison Acid Vitality damage. Absolutely fantastic. Again, this is a two-handed option if you really want to go Bone Harvest, which I don't usually go with these. This one I don't usually go with either. I will usually go with this one. I don't necessarily always use Siphon Souls, but the Devouring Swarm is nice. This is also pardon me, I forgot about this one. I haven't used this one in a very long time. So my information on this one is a little outdated. But we have Ravenous Earth increase and Devouring Swarm here, which of course goes with the maggots. Where'd the maggots go? Here's the maggots. Also goes with the Bone Spike, of course. And also goes with Halanx's head. Just an excellent metal. The Mark of Blood, of course, is a stopgap. The Badge of Desecration is probably a better stopgap if you're into Entangling Vines, or even if you're not. Foul Eruption plus the increase to Vitality and Poison Acid is fairly good. Between the two of these, this is a personal preference. They're both stopgaps. And then, of course, you have this if you want to splash in some pets with Raised Skeletons. Again, just as a suggestion out there, if you really want to. I don't use pets with this, but you can. But yeah, that was part 2. I rushed through some of the later ones because the video was taking quite a while, and we talked about a lot of the equipment earlier. I did hit all the points I wanted to hit with that, though, so thank you all very much for joining me, and if you liked this, please like and subscribe. If you have any comments, questions, concerns, suggestions, ideas, what have you, please leave them down in the comment section below, and thank you all very much for joining me. I will sleep now. Have a great 24 hours.